my name is Kendra. Betrayal doesn't always come from lies, or from the things we do. Sometimes, it comes from the things we feel. I told myself it was just a ride. Just a moment. A silly, inconvenient seating arrangement on a long drive. Nothing more. But looking back, I should have never gotten into that car. Because by the time I realized the truth, by the time I understood the weight of what I had let happen, I had already destroyed everything. This is a personal story, one I never wanted to tell. But sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones we need to face. This is not a story about physical betrayal. There are no graphic details, only the raw reality of emotional infidelity and the consequences of blurred boundaries. If you've ever questioned a feeling, a fleeting thought, if you've ever convinced yourself that something small could never become something dangerous, then maybe, like me, you'll see just how quickly the ground beneath you can crumble. It was August. The kind of morning where the heat clings to your skin, thick and suffocating. The kind of morning that makes the air feel heavy, pressing against your chest like a weight you can't shake. I remember standing in the driveway, wiping the sweat from my forehead, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The pavement shimmered from the heat, and the sound of cicadas filled the air, loud, rhythmic, relentless. I told myself the tightness in my chest was just the weather. That the unease bubbling beneath my ribs was nothing more than the stress of the day. Because days like this were supposed to feel emotional, right? Jackson Prince, my stepson, was leaving for college. I kept telling myself this was normal. That the nervous energy thrumming under my skin was the same thing every mother felt when their child was about to leave home. That this strange sense of loss, of something slipping away, was just part of parenthood. I clung to that thought as I turned back toward the car. The trunk was already full, stuffed to the brim with everything Jackson thought he needed for his new life. Clothes, books, shoes, a mini fridge. His laptop was safely tucked away in his backpack, his gaming console wedged somewhere between his duffel bags. And yet, somehow, there was still more. I could feel the tension rising between us, thick and unspoken, as we stared at the car, trying to figure out what else we could possibly squeeze inside. Luciano wiped the back of his neck with a handkerchief, his patience wearing thin in the heat. "You're gonna have to leave something behind, kid," he said, shaking his head. "We're out of space." Jackson stood there, his jaw set, looking between his belongings and the packed car. His fingers twitched against his sides, the way they always did when he was thinking. And then, I saw it. The thing he was clutching in his hands like it was the most valuable thing he owned. His TV. A bulky, 42-inch screen, still wrapped in the same faded moving blanket he had used when we first bought it 2 years ago. I sighed, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "Jackson," I started, keeping my voice calm, "there's no way that's going to fit." "Maybe if we shift some stuff around in the back seat," he offered, already moving toward the car. Luciano let out a dry chuckle. "What back seat?" "Look at it. There's no room." Jackson peered inside, brows furrowing as he tried to find an answer. But deep down, he already knew the truth. I did too. I should have just told him no. I should have insisted that he leave it behind. But instead, I hesitated. Because I saw something in his expression, a kind of quiet desperation that made my heart ache. Maybe it was because I had raised him since he was 10. Maybe it was because, despite everything, I still saw him as the little boy who used to cling to my hand in crowded places. Maybe it was because I knew this wasn't just about a TV. It was about holding on, to something familiar, to something comforting, to something that made leaving home feel less terrifying. I sighed, my resolve wavering. "Maybe we can put it in the middle of the front seat," Jackson finally said, his voice careful, testing the waters. I hesitated. Looked at Luciano. He shrugged, already too exhausted to argue. "Fine. But then where's your mom going to sit?" That's when it happened. That's when everything changed. Jackson's lips parted, and for a second, he didn't say anything at all. Just stared at me like he was considering something. And then, so casually, so effortlessly, he said it. She can sit on my lap. Silence. Thick. Unsettling. Luciano laughed, brushing the comment off like it was nothing. She's small enough, he said, like it was some kind of joke. She doesn't weigh much. But I didn't laugh. I stood there, the words still lingering in the air, and something inside me hesitated. Not because I thought it was inappropriate. Not because I was uncomfortable. Not at first. But because of the way he looked at me. It was only for a second, so brief that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. A flicker of something in his eyes. Something I didn't understand. And that was the moment, the exact moment, I should have said no. But I didn't. I should have said no. I should have laughed, shaken my head, told Jackson it was ridiculous. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, staring at my husband, Luciano, as he climbed into the driver's seat, completely unbothered, adjusting his mirrors like this was nothing. Like nothing had changed. Jackson stood beside me, waiting. One hand gripping the car door, the other wrapped around his TV, the same way he used to hold on to things as a child, tight, protective, like letting go wasn't an option. But he wasn't a child anymore. And I wasn't prepared for what that meant. I hesitated. Luciano had laughed it off, shrugging. She's small enough. She doesn't weigh much. I glanced at Jackson, expecting him to laugh too, but he didn't. He just looked at me. And for some reason, that made my stomach twist. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. So I got in. The moment I lowered myself onto his lap, I felt it. Not physically. Not in the way one might assume. But something shifted. The air felt different. The space between us was gone, replaced by something unspoken. Jackson tensed beneath me, just for a second, just long enough for me to notice, before forcing himself to relax. The car door shut beside me, a final, echoing sound. And just like that, we were on the road. The first few miles were quiet. Luciano hummed along to the song on the radio, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. Jackson stayed still beneath me. Too still. And me? I kept my hands folded in my lap, back straight, trying to pretend this was normal. Trying to ignore the fact that I was suddenly aware of everything. The way Jackson's chest rose and fell, controlled. The way his hands stayed clenched in his lap, like he didn't know what to do with them. The heat between us, pressed close in the small space, sinking into my skin. It was just a car ride. That's what I kept telling myself. Over and over. But I didn't believe it anymore. I turned to Luciano, needing to break the silence. Are we making good time? Luciano nodded, eyes on the road. Yeah. Should be there in about 10 hours, give or take. 10 hours. 10 hours like this. I forced a nod, looked down at my hands. Jackson still hadn't moved. And with every passing minute, I could feel it more, the thick, quiet tension sitting between us. It wasn't in my head. Something was wrong. At some point, I tried to shift, adjusting my position, trying to make myself more comfortable. And that's when I felt it. Jackson's breath hitched. Just barely. Just for a second. But I noticed. And suddenly, I knew. This wasn't just me. Jackson felt it too. I should have stopped it then. I should have said something. But I didn't. Instead, I turned to Luciano, forcing my voice to sound normal. Do you have enough room to drive? Luciano nodded, adjusting the rear-view mirror. Yeah. You two okay over there? A joke. A casual question. One that shouldn't have made my pulse stutter. Fine, I said, too quickly. And then? The car hit a pothole. Not a big one. Just enough to make the car jolt forward, just enough to make me lose balance, just enough to make me react. My hand landed on Jackson's arm. And that was it. That was all it took. Jackson's entire body locked up. A sharp inhale, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Luciano didn't notice. Didn't hear it. Didn't feel the way Jackson's muscles went rigid beneath my palm, the way his body tensed like a coiled wire before forcing itself to relax. I snatched my hand away immediately. But it was too late. Because in that single, fleeting moment, something had already happened. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I kept my eyes forward, watching the road stretch endlessly before us, my mind grasping for anything to focus on, anything but the growing awareness beneath me. Outside, the world passed in a blur, gas stations, roadside motels, open fields that stretched on for miles. Inside, the car was silent except for the occasional rustling of bags shifting in the back seat and the steady, rhythmic sound of the tires against the pavement. Luciano hummed quietly along to the radio, fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. Jackson was silent. Too silent. I told myself he was just tired. That he was staring out the window, lost in thought, thinking about his future, about college, about everything that lay ahead of him. But I felt it. His hands. Resting on his thighs, balled into fists. Knuckles pale. Breathing slow. Too slow. Controlled. Like he was holding something back. Like he was bracing himself. I swallowed hard, shifting slightly in my seat, adjusting myself in the smallest way possible. Jackson didn't move. Didn't flinch. But I could feel it. The tension sitting between us, unspoken, heavy. I told myself I was imagining it. That it was nothing. But the longer we sat there, the harder it became to believe my own lies. Then, it happened. A song came on. Not just any song. One I had danced to with Luciano once, years ago, before we were married, before life had settled into routine. It was slow, familiar, filled with old memories I hadn't revisited in years. Without thinking, I shifted again, just slightly, just enough to adjust my weight, just enough to settle myself more comfortably on Jackson's lap. And that's when I felt it. Jackson tensed beneath me. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locking up for a split second before he forced himself to exhale, to relax, to pretend nothing had happened. But I noticed. Of course, I noticed. Asterisk. I told myself it was the way I moved. That maybe I had leaned too far in one direction, put too much pressure on his leg. That maybe I was overanalyzing things. But I knew better. Because that wasn't the reaction of someone who was merely uncomfortable. It was something else. Something deeper. Something I should have never allowed to happen. And yet, I didn't say anything. I didn't shift away. I didn't move. I just sat there, pretending I hadn't felt it. Pretending I didn't notice the way Jackson was breathing through his nose now, slow and measured, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. Pretending that the tension I felt wasn't real. Because acknowledging it would make it real. And if it was real, then that meant something had already changed between us. And I wasn't ready to admit that yet. I turned to Luciano, forcing my voice to sound normal. What exit do we take again? Luciano glanced at me, one hand adjusting the GPS screen. Exit 217. Should be in about an hour. An hour. 60 more minutes of this. Of pretending nothing had changed. I nodded, forcing a smile I didn't feel, looking back at the road as if that could somehow erase what had just happened. As if I could just forget it. But I couldn't. Because now, I wasn't just aware of Jackson. I was hyper-aware of him. Every breath. Every movement. Every single thing I had ignored before was now impossible to unsee. And that terrified me. Luciano reached for his water bottle, taking a sip, casually glancing at me in the rearview mirror. You okay? He asked. It was a simple question. One I should have answered easily. But my throat felt dry. Because no. I wasn't okay. Not anymore. Not when I was suddenly aware of the way Jackson's thighs tensed beneath me every time I moved even the slightest bit. Not when I could feel the heat of his body through my dress, the way he was trying so hard not to shift, not to react, not to do anything that would make this worse. Not when I realized, too late, that I had made a mistake getting into this car. I'm fine, I lied, forcing a small laugh. Just tired. Luciano nodded, satisfied with the answer. Jackson said nothing. And I just sat there. Counting the miles. Counting the minutes. Trying to convince myself that this wasn't what it felt like. That I wasn't sitting on a time bomb. That I hadn't just crossed a line I could never uncross. I ignored it. I had to. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, on the hum of the tires against the pavement, on Luciano's occasional humming as he tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That I was reading too much into things. That I was overthinking every single second that passed. But the harder I tried to push the thought away, the worse it got. Because then, I started noticing other things. The way he looked at me in the rearview mirror. Not just glancing. Not just out of habit. Lingering. Like he was waiting for me to look back, like he was trying to catch my eyes in a way that wasn't casual anymore. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. Every few minutes, his gaze would shift. A flicker of movement. A second too long. I wasn't supposed to notice. But I did. And it wasn't just that. It was the way he responded to me. Too quickly. Too eagerly. Like he was waiting for any excuse to be part of my conversation, like he was desperate for my attention in a way that didn't feel normal anymore. Luciano would say something, half joking, and I would laugh. A small laugh. An automatic reaction. But Jackson's reaction came before mine had even faded. Like he was hanging on to every sound that left my mouth. Like my laughter meant something more to him than it should have. And suddenly, I was aware of it. Of him. Of everything I had refused to acknowledge before. Then there was the heat. The warmth of his body against mine. At first, I told myself it was just the temperature in the car. That it was just a warm day, that the AC wasn't strong enough, that the body heat between us was nothing unusual. But then I realized. It wasn't just the warmth. It was the way it was seeping into me. The way it made my pulse quicken when it shouldn't have. The way my breath would hitch when I shifted my weight, feeling him beneath me, reminding me of what I was ignoring. And suddenly, I didn't know what scared me more. The way I was noticing these things. Or the fact that deep down, I didn't want to stop noticing them. And then, it hit me. Like a truck. Like a sudden crash that left no room for doubt. This was real. Something had changed. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It wasn't something I could excuse away as awkwardness or a coincidence or a trick of my imagination. I wasn't supposed to feel like this. Not about him. Not about Luciano's son. And yet, here I was. Heart pounding. Skin tingling. Stomach twisting. The guilt set in immediately. Like a sickness crawling up my throat. Like I had already done something wrong. Like I had already crossed a line just by letting myself feel it. But guilt isn't proof of innocence. And deep down, I already knew. I had let something happen. And I wasn't sure I could take it back. That night, at the motel, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The road trip was over. Jackson was in his dorm. Luciano was asleep beside me, breathing slow, steady, unaware. It should have been over. Everything that had happened that day, the tension, the stolen glances, the shifts in weight, the moments I tried to convince myself I had imagined, it should have ended when Jackson stepped out of the car. It should have stayed there, locked in the past, in a moment that no longer existed. But it didn't. Because I was still there. Still in that car. Still feeling the heat of his body against mine. Still feeling the phantom sensation of my hand on his arm, of his breath catching in his throat, of that unbearable silence between us, louder than anything else I had ever known. I rolled onto my side, pressing my cheek into the stiff motel pillow. Luciano shifted beside me, adjusting himself in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent before falling still again. For a split second, I envied him. His peace. His complete, effortless ignorance. Because for him, today had been nothing more than a drive. A long road trip. A day spent loading and unloading boxes. Nothing else. But for me. For Jackson. Today had changed everything. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep. I told myself I was tired. That the weight in my chest was just exhaustion. That in the morning, this would all feel different. But no matter how many times I turned over, no matter how tightly I pulled the blankets around me, my mind wouldn't let it go. It kept replaying every second. Every moment in that car. The quiet shifts. The tension in his body. The way he had looked at me in the mirror, eyes lingering just a second too long. The way I had felt it, the shift, the change, the line that had already been crossed long before I was willing to admit it. And then, the final words he had said before he walked into his dorm. Thanks for the ride. Not see you later. Not I love you guys. Just that. A simple, hollow statement that should have meant nothing. But somehow, it did. I turned onto my back again, staring at the ceiling, my hands clenched beneath the sheets. I told myself I needed to move on. That I had no reason to still be thinking about this. Jackson was gone. Luciano was here. Tomorrow, life would be normal again. And then? My phone buzzed. The sound cut through the silence like a knife, sharp and immediate. For a second, I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just stared at the glow of the screen, pulse hammering in my throat. It was late. Too late. And I already knew. Before I even reached for it. Before I even turned it over in my hands. I already knew. But I looked anyway. Jackson. A single message. I can't stop thinking about today. I inhaled sharply, my thumb hovering over the screen, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake Luciano. I could have deleted it. I should have deleted it. I should have turned off my phone, set it on the nightstand, rolled over, and forced myself to forget that message ever existed. But I didn't. Because I couldn't. Because my hands were already shaking. Because my mind was already racing. Because my stomach was already tightening with something I didn't want to name. Because for the first time, I had confirmation. It wasn't just me. Jackson felt it too. And I didn't know whether that realization made me sick. Or if, deep down, I had been waiting for it. I stared at the message, my pulse thrumming against my skin. Luciano stirred beside me, shifting in his sleep. For a split second, panic seized my chest. If he woke up and saw me like this. Phone in hand. Body stiff. Breath shallow. What would I even say? Would he know? Would he look at me and see what I had done? What I was about to do? I had a choice. A simple one. Delete it. Or respond. Erase everything. Or let it linger. Walk away. Or cross the line. One choice. One moment. And then, without even realizing I had made my decision, my fingers started moving. One word at a time. Steady. Deliberate. I typed. We need to talk when you're settled in at college. And then, I hit send. That was it. No second guessing. No hesitation. No undoing it. It was done. And for the first time that night, I let out a slow, shaky breath. Because now, the line wasn't just crossed. It was gone. Infidelity isn't always about bodies. Sometimes, it's about the heart. About the thoughts you let linger. About the moments you don't stop. About the choices you make, even when you know you shouldn't. Because betrayal doesn't always happen in a single act. Sometimes, it's slow. Subtle. A whisper instead of a scream. A glance held too long. A touch not immediately pulled away. A message that should have never been sent. And suddenly, before you even realize it, you're standing on the other side of a line you swore you'd never cross. I used to think cheating was simple. A decision. A conscious, deliberate act. But now, I know better. Now, I know it starts in the smallest moments, in a car ride that should have meant nothing. In a hesitation that never should have happened. In a message sent in the dark, with my husband lying just inches away. Because the truth is, infidelity isn't just about what you do. It's about what you allow yourself to feel. People think they'd never do it. That they're better than that. That they'd see it coming and stop it before it got too far. But I'm living proof that's not always how it happens. That sometimes, you don't even realize what you're doing. Until it's too late. Until you're already falling. Until you look back and realize. The moment you thought you still had control? It was already gone. Luciano never knew. Not about the thoughts. Not about the way my pulse quickened in that car. Not about the message I sent that night, my hands trembling as I hit send. Not about the way I lay awake afterward, staring at my phone, waiting for a reply. And feeling a thrill of anticipation when it finally came. But the thing about secrets is, they don't stay buried forever. They rot. They fester. They spread through every corner of your life until, one day, you wake up. And the person in the mirror isn't someone you recognize anymore. So, yes. Infidelity isn't always about bodies. Sometimes, it's about the heart. The mind. The choices you make in the quiet moments, when no one is watching. And sometimes, the smallest betrayal is the one that ruins everything.